Imagine this. We're in British India, and a totally normal, kind of boring administrative task, just counting people, is about to become a political firestorm. This wasn't just record keeping, it was an act that threatened to completely redraw the map of identity and power for an entire nation. And that's the big question, right? How does that even happen? Because this whole story isn't just about numbers on a page. It's about how those numbers get collected, who gets to decide the categories, and what happens when your population size suddenly equals your political power. So here's where it all kicks off. In 1910, a British official, a guy named Edward Albert Gait, sends out this memo. It became known as the Gait Circular, and in it were 10 tests, basically 10 questions designed to figure out who should really be counted as a Hindu. The result? Total panic among the Hindu elite, because they were terrified their majority status and all the political clout that came with it was about to just vanish. So, what were these 10 questions? What was in this circular that caused so much chaos? Let's take a look. Okay, so Gait's list had a bunch of criteria, and you can see some of the most critical ones right here. Census officials were told to look for communities that did things like, say, deny the supremacy of Brahmins, or weren't allowed inside Hindu temples. Or maybe they were considered polluting just by touch, or they ate beef. Now, here's the thing. These were not random questions. They were specifically designed to separate millions of people, groups we know today as Dalits, from the orthodox Hindu category they'd always been lumped into. On the surface, you might think, okay, this is just a clumsy, maybe kind of offensive attempt at classification. So why the massive uproar? Well, because this was never really about theology. It was 100% about politics. To really get the panic, we have to look at the vibe before the census circular even showed up. There was this deep, simmering fear already brewing among Hindu elites. You could call it a kind of numerical anxiety. And this feeling was captured perfectly, just 1 year earlier. In 1909, a writer named Mukerji published this absolutely explosive pamphlet, Hindus, A Dying Race. His argument was basically that the Hindu community was crumbling from the inside out, thanks to the caste system's brutal exclusion of millions. His warning was pretty stark. If you build your society on disunity, you're doomed. Now, Mukerji wasn't just being dramatic. He was using actual census data to prove his point. Take Bengal, for example. Over about 30 years, the Muslim population had grown almost twice as fast as the Hindu population. For the Hindu elite, this wasn't just a number. It was terrifying proof that they were being outnumbered and losing control. But Mukerji's most devastating point was about the rot from within. He calculated that the high castes, the ones with all the power, made up a tiny 13% of the so-called Hindu population, and yet they treated the other 87% as degrading or contaminating. I mean, how can a community even survive when a small elite won't even associate with the vast majority of its own people? So here's the crucial point. The Gait Circular landed on this perfectly fertile grounds of numerical anxiety. The fear wasn't just about losing a religious identity. It was about losing cold, hard political power in a colonial system where representation was getting more and more tied to population numbers. So, faced with this threat, this existential crisis, the upper caste leaders didn't respond by trying to dismantle the caste system. Nope. Instead, they went for a purely political strategy. They wanted unity, but it was a unity that came without any real reform. For centuries, the entire strategy was built on social exclusion, keeping lower castes out of temples, away from sacred texts, far from power. But after 1910, when their numbers were suddenly needed to form a majority, the whole strategy just flipped on its head. Suddenly, it was all about political inclusion. The very same people who had been kept out were now declared essential members of the Hindu family. So how did they do it? Well, they used a few key tactics. You had movements like Shuddhi, or purification ceremonies, which were used to symbolically bring lower castes back into Hinduism. Then, whenever lower caste groups tried to demand their own separate political identity, those movements were slammed as anti-national and divisive. The whole point was to present this united front, which allowed upper caste leaders to claim they spoke for a massive Hindu majority, and therefore controlled that entire voting bloc. And this whole political scramble in 1910, it didn't just fade away. It actually ended up creating official state categories that have shaped Indian society and politics ever since. You can literally draw a straight line from this one administrative memo. Gait's attempt to classify people led directly to the creation of an official category called depressed classes in the 1931 census. That political label then fueled a huge deadlock in 1932 over voting rights, and by 1935, the term evolved again, this time into scheduled castes, which was formally written into law, a category that, as you know, still exists today. But here's the incredible twist. The very same tool the British used was picked up by leaders from the marginalized communities themselves. The legendary Dr. B.R. Ambedkar actually pointed to the Gait Circular as evidence. He said, look, even the British recognize that we are not fully part of the Hindu social order. He used it as a powerful argument for why Dalits, the empowering term he championed, deserved their own separate political rights and representation. And this quote from Ambedkar just sums it all up, doesn't it? The census stopped being a simple head count. It became a political battlefield, a place where identities were literally defined, fought over, and weaponized. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The story of the 1910 census in India is a perfect example of how a simple bureaucratic tool can become a weapon that shapes a nation's destiny. And it forces us to ask a really important question. In any society where numbers equal power, can counting people ever truly be a neutral act? It's a question that echoes right down to today, in all our debates over census forms, identity politics, and how data continues to define who we are.